To tell you that we will be starting in 4 minutes. So you need to find your seat and sit down. They're all so quiet already. But we're not starting for 4, so you can talk for 4 minutes. It's now 3 minutes. You have 3 minutes to get your act together. And don't make me come back up here. Well, actually, I will be back up here. I'm just going to stay up here. Yeah. Well, that was sort of disappointing. Okay. Linda, where'd she go? Linda's husband is right here. Lou, this is my sister. Yeah. We're good? Okay. I've been told we can begin. So my name is Jean Becker, and the most important thing you need to know about me is I grew up in Missouri. I left Missouri in 1981. For the last 32 years, I have literally lived 10 minutes from Minute Maid Park, where the Houston Astros play baseball, and I'm still a diehard St. Louis Cardinal fan. I knew I would capture the audience if I started with that. President Bush considered it one of his biggest life failures that he did not turn me into an Astros fan, but he did not. So just a little bit, I'll tell you a little bit about me, and I'm going to introduce Linda in a little bit. So I grew up on a farm about 2 hours west of here, Audrain County. When the University of Missouri graduated from the School of Journalism and Arts and Sciences, I was a newspaper reporter for 10 years. My last newspaper was USA Today. I then jumped to the White House to be Barbara Bush's, one of her deputy press secretaries, and then I went back to Houston with them in 1993 when he lost the election, and worked for George Bush for the next 25 years. I was his chief of staff until the day he died. I'm thinking now that I've told you that I've worked at the White House, I worked for USA Today, I was his chief of staff, you're still hung up that I'm a Cardinal fan. Yeah, I knew it. I knew you were. Before we get to tonight's program, I just want to explain civil dialogues to you and what this is all about. While serving as President Bush's Chief of Staff, I became acquainted with Linda Lorelle, who was the anchor of Houston's NBC affiliate for 17 years. She was President Bush's favorite local reporter. If he had something he wanted to talk about, we called Linda. And in the process, we became friends too. A couple years ago, Linda and I were sitting in a bar. Okay, that's not true. We were having lunch. But it would be such a better story if we were in a bar. And we were worried about our country. We were worried about how divided we were, how, no one could agree to disagree anymore. It was either my way or the highway. And we decided rather than yell at our TV sets and that we should do something, do anything. And we also thought that we were sort of the perfect odd couple to do this. She's a black woman from South Chicago who grew up a Democrat. I'm a white farm girl from the Midwest who grew up a Democrat but worked for 30 years for the Bush family. So if Linda and I could have civil dialogue, why can't the rest of you people? So we Okay, my sister who's here claims I'm turning into Barbara Bush, so if I'm a little blind. Speaking of which, I do have 4 cousins here. I have 4 cousins, 1 niece, 1 nephew. I have a lot of family here, and I'm very grateful. I'm related to half of the audience. Grateful for them coming. Anyway, Linda and I began a conversation with the heads of the Georgia Barbara Bush Foundation at Texas A&M, the LBJ Library people in Austin, the Clinton Library people in Little Rock, Arkansas, and we developed a partnership with the Kinder Institute on Constitutional Democracy at the University of Missouri, on whose advisory board I'm very proud to serve. And everybody was very supportive, and we finally kicked off civil dialogues about a year ago at the Becker Institute, which is at Rice University in Houston. Since then, we have talked about immigration, climate change, the importance of bipartisanship, the Middle East, why young people are too scared to run for office. And after the election in November, we went back to the Becker Institute and tried to analyze the election results. If nothing else, you can't call us cowards. We pretty well have tackled just about everything. The idea of civil dialogues is to give you a chance to listen to experts on both sides of an issue. After all, every issue does have both sides. And then give you a chance to ask your questions, voice your concerns, and let us know what you think. No shouting, no name calling, no vitriol. Just dialogue, civil dialogue. Tonight, our topic is the people, the president, and the Constitution. Your questions answered. And we will have a big Q&A. And I was telling Linda, I just glanced at my phone like a half hour ago. This is why we need to have conversations like this. This is my old newspaper, USA Today. So this isn't the New York Times, this is not the Washington Post, if you think they're too liberal, nor is it the Wall Street Journal or the New York Post on the right side. This is USA Today. Their lead story right now, does the Constitution allow Trump to kill the education department? This is the kind of stuff we need to talk about tonight. So before I turn it over to Linda and our incredible panelists, I want to start the evening by giving you some food for thought. What the hell are we doing? Okay, I gave up cursing for Lent. Okay, scratch that. Instead, I'm going to show you 2 book covers. Karen, could you show the first? Okay, thank you. This is a book I wrote. It came out about a year ago called Character Matters about President Bush. My book tour should be over. My editor is sort of in a state of shock. I mean, this came out a year ago. I have 18 events scheduled this year, including speaking to the Missouri State School Board Association in June. I actually talked to the Virginia State School Board Association in November. I think people just have a hunger to talk about character. So you look at this book cover. Recently, a friend of mine sent me this book. because these books sit next to each other in my living room in Houston. The good news is you don't have to read this book because Jay Sexton from the Kinder Institute is here tonight, and he can answer all your questions about the Constitution. But it's just such an interesting contrast. So again, this cover sort of begs the question, I'm going to do a little self-editing here. What the heck are we doing? I want to challenge all of you to think about our expectations of our elected leaders. I don't care who you voted for. I don't care what party you belong to. But as voters, we should have expectations of our elected leaders and how they represent us. And among those expectations, they should be willing to do what is right, show moral courage and fortitude, and to show character. I was blessed to work for someone like that. So of course, I'm going to use President Bush as an example. When he was president in 1990, he was determined to balance the budget. Does that sound familiar? Both houses of Congress were controlled by the Democrats. And he did something that has become a dirty word today for some odd reason. He compromised. He agreed to a very small tax increase in exchange for major budget cuts from the Democrats. And he wrote in his diary during the negotiations, he wrote in his diary one night, I found this diary entry I can't remember when I found it, but I was stunned when I saw it. He said, I think some of these proposals could mean a one-term presidency for me. But it's that important for the country. It's right for the country. We should elect people who are willing to think like this every day. I want you to think about, I'm thinking about my people in Texas. Nope, none of them would write this. We should have elected officials who are willing to write in their diary, this is what's right for the country, so I'm going to do it. Unfortunately, we know he was right. He did lose the 1992 election, and a lot of the cause was the 1990 budget deal. It's the same budget deal that the Wall Street Journal a few years later gave credit to the robust economy during the 1990s. So President Bush was right in both cases. It did cost him, he was a one-term president, but it was right for the country. Speaking of Bill Clinton, okay, he was the one he lost to. The other example I want to point out, can you show the next picture, Karen? The friendship of these two became one of the most talked about things in America. They became friends. President George W. Bush asked his dad to partner with President Clinton to help raise money after a huge tsunami in South Asia in 2004. And I'm anxious to get to our panel, so I'm not going to tell you the whole story. But just know that by the time President Bush died, they were best friends. I think President Bush was the father that Bill Clinton never had. But this is a great example of two men who politically could not be more different, but managed to put their differences aside and work together for a common cause. And when I was thinking about what that common cause was, I realized it was us. They had our best interests in mind. They raised money for like 7 or 8 hurricanes. I hate to sound selfish, but every time I saw a hurricane on the map, I thought, oh crap, here we go again. But they raised hundreds of millions of dollars. When Hurricane Harvey dumped 40 inches of rain on Houston in 48 hours in 2017, all of the former presidents wanted to help. They all came to a concert at Texas A&M. Could you show this picture, Karen? I do want you to ignore the woman in the back of the photo. I know she looks like me. I have no idea who that is. I would never photobomb the presidents. Just focus. Yeah, that's embarrassing. I almost wore that top. There's 2 things I love about this photo. One is President Bush, when President Bush would be asked by some of his more conservative friends, how can you be friends with Bill Clinton? He would say, I like him, I like the man. And then he would say, I'm whatever old, I'm 80, whatever. I've run out of things to say. And when I'm with Bill, I don't have to worry about that because he does all the talking. I want you to look at who's doing the talking. He must be telling a pretty good story. This is how it's supposed to be. We need to get back to this. We need to get back where Democrats, Republicans, where people from the different sides of the aisle come together for a common cause. And that is sort of my challenge to all of you tonight, to get us to help our elected officials get back to this. I will just end before I introduce Linda. Pulitzer Prize winning author and historian John Meacham was one of President Bush's eulogists, and he said in his eulogy, "It was and is the most American of creeds, Abraham Lincoln's better angels of our nature, and George H.W. Bush's thousands points of light. They are companion verses in America's national hymn. For Lincoln and Bush both called on us to choose the right over the convenient, to hope rather than to fear, and to heed not our worst impulses, but our best instincts." So those are the words I want to leave you with. Now it's time for me to turn this over to my partner, Linda. Linda was an Emmy Award-winning journalist at Channel 2 in Houston for 17 years. Her journalism chops were honed the master's program at the University of Missouri, School of Journalism. We're both Tigers. She's not a Cardinal fan, though. I feel all y'all needed to know that. Today, she is CEO and executive producer of Linda Lorelle Media, a video production and communication consulting firm. And while she comes up on stage, on behalf of Linda and me both, we just want to thank Jay Sexton and Karen Huffman-Grinch at the Kinder Institute, and Ashley Beard Forno. Did I say that right? Fasno. I can't read. It's very dark up here. Fasno, there she is. And her wonderful assistant, Caitlin Yeager, Missouri Humanities. They're our sponsors tonight. Without Ashley and Jay and Karen and Caitlin, Linda and I would be out in the parking lot hoping some of you would show up. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And on that note, Linda, all right. It's all yours.
Oh, Jean, you're going to need your phone. Jean, here's your phone. Here you go. I think you're going to need that. Okay. Thank you. Hello, everybody. It is so wonderful to be back in St. Louis. My first TV job was here, just down the road a bit at KMOV, and I lived right over here in the Central West End for a bit, so this has been like a little bit of a homecoming for us tonight. We drove through, had some great dinner last night, and it's just really wonderful to be here, especially with my Mizzou family. So thank you all so much for coming, and Jean, thank you for that very nice introduction. Okay, the people, the president, and the Constitution. We need all three working in tandem to ensure a functioning, healthy democracy. You, the people, could be anywhere tonight, but you're here doing your part as an engaged citizen. And thank you for that. I think it's fair to say that we tend to underestimate our power, and because of that, we often disengage or choose not to engage at all. According to U.S. News and World Report, more than 150 million of our fellow Americans voted in November. Close to 90 million didn't. The office of the presidency and the person who holds the title are intended to represent a co-equal branch of government, along with Congress and the judiciary. That's what the U.S. Constitution says. What else does it say about how our government should function, and what recourse do we, the people, have when it veers off course? Many of us are terrified of the course being set just 6 weeks into the second term of President Donald Trump. And many of us are cheering him on, saying this is what America elected him to do. The question is it constitutional? That is one of the many questions we seek to explore tonight with our panelists and all of you. So start thinking about your questions now, including those of you who are joining us on the live stream, because all of you are a critical part of this program. And now I am pleased to introduce our panelists as we begin our civil dialogue. Jay Sexton is director of Mizzou's Kinder Institute on Constitutional Democracy, a nonpartisan center for the teaching and study of the founding and history of the United States. In his classes, students explore how the fate of American constitutional democracy has always been inseparable from the global fortunes of democracy. He has learned much about how to navigate tribal hatred by virtue of being a KU alumnus who lives and breathes Jayhawk basketball, but lives and works in Columbia, Missouri. He takes booze from Tiger faithful in good spirits. Oh, come on now. Please welcome Jay. Kathy Kiely is the Lee Hills Chair in Free Press Studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. Before coming to Mizzou in 2018, she spent nearly 4 decades covering regional and national politics for a wide range of news organizations, including USA Today, the New York Daily News, and the Houston Post. She began working as a Washington correspondent in 1981 when George H.W. Bush was vice president. Please welcome Kathy Kiely. Steve Davis is a senior legal fellow at Pacific Legal Foundation, a nonprofit public interest law firm that defends Americans' liberties when threatened by government overreach and abuse. Steve previously served as the chief clerk and administrator of the Missouri House of Representatives, an assistant United States attorney, and as the Missouri Election Day operations director for the Mitt Romney 2012 presidential campaign. He lives in Crestwood, where he serves as the city's municipal judge. Please welcome Steve Davis. And Abby Ramirez is a senior pursuing dual degrees in journalism and constitutional democracy with minors in history and political science. She is originally from Los Angeles, California, but has spent the last 4 years in Columbia at the University of Missouri. Abby is currently the feature editor at Vox Magazine and a communication research intern at Emily's List, a political organization that works to elect pro-choice Democratic women around the country. Please welcome Abby Ramirez. Okay. All right, so let's get this conversation started. Jay, putting you on the hot seat to begin, okay? Jean just gave us a headline, but in recent weeks, we've seen a lot of headlines, and many of them say that we are in a full-blown constitutional crisis. I read a headline this morning that said, Trump, Musk are committing crimes, tearing up the Constitution, betraying the country, and Democrats need to say so. The article went on to say, the Musk assault on the U.S. government is unconstitutional, illegal, and wrong, and it is outside of what would be permissible in any democracy, in any country, at any time in history. So my question to you, Jay, is this hyperbole, truth, or somewhere in between?
Well, I'm glad we're starting off with a softball question.
Hey, it's the journalist in me. It's what I learned at Mizzou. Okay?
Yeah, I get booed for being a Jayhawk, and then I get the tough question. But
you asked for it.
Hey, look, I wrote a book in 2018 called A Nation Forged by Crisis, and it was a history of the United States. And one of the things I was arguing was, hey, everybody, calm down. This was 2017, 2018. We're not in the midst of a crisis. I don't think that would be my position right now in 2025 for a couple of reasons. First, most important is that people think we're in a crisis. That's what matters. You know, it's not necessarily the reality, it's what people think and how they perceive and understand it. When we talk about the Constitution later today, never forget the most important thing about the Constitution. It's just an old piece of paper with words on it. What makes the Constitution powerful is that people believe in it. They give it the legitimacy. So it's the erosion of public trust. I think that's the most important point. Second thing, and crisis, if you look at like what is a crisis, how do we define it? I think a defining feature of crisis is that it spreads from one realm of public life to another. It can't be contained. Institutions no longer function. I'd say that's kind of the case now. I mean, we do have a political constitutional crisis. We have, and always lead with this, we have a Congress that hasn't really done its job for a quarter century, probably longer. That's the core of the problem. We also have an executive branch that can't fulfill its ambitions and exercise its decision-making without taking on new powers, and that's going to put it in conflict with the Supreme Court, and we'll talk more about that. So that's a kind of political crisis, but that's not the only thing that's happening. Think about the international crisis. Yeah, which is linked to that. Our Constitution is a written document about the United States. It's also a set of norms and behaviors and expectations for international affairs. That's been completely disrupted and upended in the last 6 weeks, yes, but again, it's been a much longer story. So it's spreading. One could also add the economy. An economic crisis may be in our future as well. So it's spreading. That's a key thing about a crisis. And then the last thing I'll say, Linda, to keep it brief, a hallmark of crisis in the past is that no one controls what happens. No one can predict what happens. The unexpected becomes the norm. And I think we're kind of living through that head-spinning volatility, the ground shifting right underneath our feet. Things that we thought were unimaginable just a few months or a few years ago are now kind of expected in the norm. This pace of change is accelerating, and that looks like some of those crises we've had in the past. So yeah, I guess that's kind of a bummer to start this conversation, but that's my view, taking the long view of American history, not being caught up in the headlines each day, but just stepping back and looking at the pace of change, the unexpected nature of it, and how it's really endemic to all aspects of our society.
So Kathy, I'm going to ask you to pick up on a little bit of what Jay said there, especially the global aspect of it. So I know that you have spoken with some reporters around the world in the last several weeks. Give our audience a sense of what they are saying to you, what you're hearing from them, and what the import of that is.
Yeah, well, I think, as Jay alluded, there's expectations that have been upended, and one of the expectations that's been fairly constant for the press globally is that the United States has been a beacon of freedom and press freedom, and that when there was a crisis and a reporter in another country was in trouble, we could always rely on our officials, even officials that we had adversarial relationships with as reporters, to step up and support the notion of a free press. And I was talking to a very well-known, battle-tested Latin American journalist earlier this week, and he said to me, you know, when there are authoritarians in Washington, the authoritarians around the world feel like they have a green light.
Well, that's sobering. That's very sobering. Steve, would love to hear your perspective on what Kathy and Jay have been saying thus far. What are your thoughts when you hear the headline that I read, and I asked Jay if it was hyperbole or if it was somewhere in between, if the truth? What are your thoughts? Are we in a constitutional crisis?
No, I don't think so. Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
Yeah, I guess I'm here to give the view of the other side of the aisle. What I would say is that people just need to, I think Jay was right, just take a deep breath and listen. I think we're at this point because people haven't been listening to each other. There are a lot of upset folks who elected this president and are happy with what he's doing. I am happy with some of what he's doing. Now, when he issued the pardon of all the January 6 folks, that worried me. I do not agree with that. I think that was the wrong thing to do. But and he's a bombastic person, so I think it's, to say the least. So I think what we need to do is just listen and understand each other and not just go by headlines.
Okay, so one follow-up I have, you said we're not in a constitutional crisis yet. So what, in your mind, would put us there? What would that look like? And do you expect us to go there? I mean, what would a constitutional crisis look like from your legal perspective?
From my perspective, and I think Jay mentioned this earlier, a crisis, we'd be in crisis mode if the president actively undermined and failed to obey the Supreme Court, whatever they were to rule on any number of issues before them or coming before them. Now, we've had that happen before. I always think of Thomas Jefferson, and Andrew Jackson, who said the Supreme Court has ruled they can enforce their own order. Of course, the Supreme Court relies on the executive to enforce its actions. So we've been there before and we got through it. I don't want to go there again. Even Nixon obeyed the Supreme Court when it ruled against him. So I have hope, and to my knowledge, he has never disobeyed the Supreme Court when it has ruled.
Other courts?
I don't know.
Okay.
I'm trying to think.
But in your mind, it would have to be this, but go ahead,
Yeah.
Kathy.
I would say at least the current administration is at least going through, they're asking court permission. So I think the point that Steve makes is right. And obviously, when a court rules against you, if you disagree, you appeal to the next level up. So it really is ultimately what happens when
What
the
happens
Supreme
at the
Court
Supreme
makes a
Court is
decision.
when,
Yeah.
if he were, or the administration were to disobey, then that would constitute the crisis. So Abby, love having a young person's voice on this panel because so much of I know what all of those of us who are older are working for is to make sure that we are leaving you and your generation a healthy democracy to move forward. What is it that you and your peers are thinking about this current moment that we're in? What would you say is the overriding thought?
I would say that I think a lot of people are worried and not necessarily like one side or the other. I think a lot of people in my generation are realizing that there is an issue with being able to talk to people across the aisle and that it's leading to an inefficient government. And I think that we're all kind of grasping at straws trying to figure out what the best way forward is when we end up wanting to run or be in politics is to try to bridge this divide. But at the same time, a lot of these things are out of our hands. I think that all of us are so susceptible to algorithms and like echo chambers and really just want to, we feel better knowing when we're right. We like being reinforced in our opinions, and yet we're still grasping for other opinions out of nowhere. We're not seeking those conversations with other people, and mainly because sometimes we're not put in those situations. Like in Los Angeles, I was never really around any Republicans. I grew up a Democrat in a Democratic family. I straightened my hair once and put on a blazer and said, "Look, Mom, I look like Maddow." And then I came to Missouri, which was a completely different experience, and it was only getting out of Los Angeles that brought me those sorts of conversations, and really because I sought them out. And I think maybe that's an issue that Gen Z is seeing, but not understanding how to move forward with.
So how has that changed your perspective? I mean, having grown up, as you said, in Los Angeles and now having spent the last 4 years in mid-Missouri, how has it changed, or has it changed the way that you sort of look at the world, the way you engage with other people?
It definitely has changed everything about my mindset. I can still look back at all of my friends that still live in California and have never left, and understand where my viewpoint was before I left for college and where it is now. I would say that before I was probably the most stereotypical California Democrat you could think of, that always had the stereotypical idea of Republicans and never wanted to reach across the aisle, always thought I was right, until I came here and started realizing that everyone comes from different walks of life. Everyone is a product of their own lived environment, and the best way to try to understand other people's politics is just to understand them as people. And I think that the Kinder Institute and the School of Journalism has really just emphasized my love for understanding people as they are and not necessarily just as their politics. And I wouldn't have gotten that if I didn't leave Los Angeles.
I love that you said that, because I mean, at the end of the day, we're all people. We all pretty much basically want the same thing, but we've become so tribal in our search for that, and we sometimes forget the human piece, which is one of the reasons that Jean and I started Civil Dialogues to begin with, is to try to bring some of that human piece back. Kathy, I want to talk a little bit with you about the role of the media in all of this, in where we are right now. You've got a wonderful perspective to be able to share, having been a working member of the press for a number of years and now teaching journalists, aspiring journalists. What's the message that you think is important for us to understand about the media's role and where we are right now and how we get out of this?
Well, I think Abby was a very eloquent exponent of what the press tries to do. We are the only profession I can think of that's enshrined in the Constitution, and there's a reason for that, because the founders understood that having information for the public to make intelligent decisions is fundamental to democracy. What I see is that, and I think that maybe there are some people who are offended by the remark that the journalist made to me when there's an authoritarian in Washington, but I think what gives people that impression, there are really long-standing norms of behavior between the press and politicians that have been violated. When you see the White House saying, we get to decide who covers the president, that is an enormous norm shattering. We see some problems happening. Voice of America has been a key component of U.S. soft diplomacy since the 1940s. The very first broadcast of Voice of America to Germany in 1942 said, some days we will bring you the news every day. Some days, and this is an exact quote, some days the news will be good, some days the news will be bad, but we will always tell you the truth. And I have traveled around the world enough and spoken to people from around the world enough to tell you that the Voice of America and our media is respected all over the world because they know it's not U.S. propaganda. But now we see journalists who are simply doing the job of journalists, which sometimes means you have to cover the people who criticize the administration, being fired for that or demoted for that. And that is going to hurt American diplomacy throughout the world. Sometimes the most powerful tools of diplomacy aren't guns, they're newspapers or radio broadcasts or television broadcasts. And that has been an enormous part of our power. So when I see that kind of a break happening, it's very alarming. The other thing I would just say, to pick up on something that both Abby and Jay said, this notion, what Abby described, her experience coming from California to Missouri to a university setting and meeting different kinds of people, that is what Congress is supposed to be. That is, Congress means come together. And for years when I covered Congress, it was very hard to predict how people would react on certain issues because so much of it was human relationships. People who got to know each other, as Abby described, getting to know her friends in school, and gaining an understanding of where each other was coming from, and being able to use what now dirty word that Jean, you said you weren't cursing for Lent, but I think that word's dirty now. They compromised. And I don't know when this really started to unravel, but I think it's I can think back to the Tea Party, I think was part of it. But I think Jay is absolutely right that Congress has become dysfunctional, and that has made our government dysfunctional, and that has made voters frustrated, and that is why people are acting out at the ballot box.
So, Steve, you worked on Romney's first campaign, correct? Second campaign. And that seems like such a very different time from where we are now. Sort of piggybacking off of what Kathy was just saying about personal relationships and how members of Congress, used to have dinner together and their kids would, play baseball together and they would socialize, and that seems to not be the case anymore. Share with us a little bit about what that was like and why you think it's not that way anymore.
Yeah, well, actually, my first job out of college, I went off to D.C., and idealist. I worked for Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah, because I went to school in Utah. I left Columbia and then came back to Columbia after that. And Orrin Hatch's very good friend was Ted Kennedy.
Ted Kennedy. Mm-hmm.
They got so much done by working together, and they were fierce defenders of each other. So I got to see that, and it reminds me of President Bush and President Clinton.
Or Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm fortunate I got to see that. That's where I began. And then in the Missouri House, I saw all kinds of people working together. That was a wonderful place to be. But then, and it still is, but then term limits hit. So that's one thing. That Congress doesn't have that excuse. And I know what you mentioned. I remember Jack Danforth would talk about this all the time, is that members of Congress used to have dinner together regularly. And that apparently stopped. And so we stopped. And maybe it was Newt Gingrich who said members need to spend more time in their districts. So they didn't hang around D.C. and they went back home and campaigned 24/7. And so I think they lost that personal connection. Now in the Missouri House, we had it. I went to work in the House with a Democratic majority. And I was working for the Republicans, and we were able to get a lot done, even though, no Republican bills, of course, were allowed to pass. But through amendment and compromise, we formed a lot of coalitions and got a lot done. And then Mitt Romney, I'm just a Mitt Romney fan. I think he's a kind person who's at the same time not afraid to stand up for and say something when he sees something's wrong or someone's doing something wrong. And I'm sad that, I don't know why he went to the Senate after running for president. I wouldn't have wanted to subject myself to that kind of torture, but he did, and he stood up for things, and I miss Ornhatch, and I miss him.
So Jay, I guess, what do we do to get back to that? I mean, to get back to the place where it's okay for members to have dinner together and not just retreat to their districts and retreat to their side of the aisle and not even talk to members on the other side unless it's in a demonic sort of way. I know the Constitution doesn't prescribe that for us, but I would love your thoughts and perspective on that.
Well, we got to vote for people who will do that. I think that's the obvious answer. But I think we also have to think not just about the politics of our moment, about a political class that is dysfunctional. We have to think about the political class and how it relates to us, the people. That comes first in the headline there. The people, how do the politicians, how does our political system relate to us? And you think about American history, in many ways that's been the genius of our democracies, that there has been a two-way street there. You think about the early days of the Republic, when you would have opposing politicians, Whigs and Democrats, having dinner in Washington. That was important. You know what was more important? Is that they all would take wagon trains from their home districts to Washington, D.C., stopping at inns each night, all along the way, getting to meet people not only in their own district that had the money that could fund their campaigns, but getting to meet all the people across the country. You think about Abraham Lincoln, what's one of the things that gave him that great political touch? It was that he would hold what we now call office hours. He called them at the time public opinion baths. Public baths, where the White House, during the days of the Civil War, he would actually open his door multiple times a week, and anybody could come in and say, hey, this is what's on my mind. And the president would listen to that. Think about FDR doing that on a mass scale through the new form of the radio and the fireside chats. And say what you will about President Trump, one of the things I think that lies behind his political genius is people feel that he gets them. There is an actual connection there. Problem is it's only a connection with 50.5% of the voters, but it can clearly be done in this media landscape, in this digital age. And I think that's what we should be expecting out of the leaders, not just to meet with one another, but to engage with us, the people. The democracy is only ever going to be as strong as the social underpinnings beneath it.
Okay, one more question for you, and then I've got one for Abby, and then I'm coming to you, so be thinking of your questions. I want you to talk a little bit about executive powers. President Trump, I've lost track of how many executive orders have already been issued. How many?
More than 100.
More than 100 in the first 6 weeks of his presidency. Okay, I know he's not the only president to use executive orders. President Obama famously did it with DACA and others as well. So can you talk a little bit about executive privilege and executive powers and what the guardrails are and why we're seeing, well, I know why we're seeing some of this is because Congress won't do anything.
Yes.
Yeah, but just speak about that a little bit, please.
Okay, yeah, so this is like the tightrope walking act in our Constitution. When it was set up back in the 18th century, on the one hand, the problem was you didn't want to have too powerful of an executive. You just killed the king, as it were, with the revolution. You'd seen the dangers of unchecked powers of monarchy or an executive, and you didn't want to have another second American Revolution, right? That was actually like the big fear. Then on the other hand, you had to have like a functioning governmental system, particularly in a really dangerous international sphere of the late 18th century. And to do that, you had to have a powerful executive. That's how you conducted foreign policy. That's why the president was vested with powers as being the commander-in-chief, like the chief of the military. It's part of what we now call national security. So you tried to balance that in the original Constitution. It's quite a remarkable document in terms of how that tightrope has been stretched chronologically over time and how the system has not snapped. Now, I think it's probably come closest to snapping during moments of acute crisis like the Civil War. We don't know this today, but Abraham Lincoln was seen as a tyrant in his time because he really did violate some of those established norms and individual civil liberties, but did so in a context of total acute crisis. Yeah? So it can, I guess what I'm trying to say is it can weather a storm. It's done so before. It's a precarious balance, but that's the big dilemma for us today. Last thing, what are the guardrails? What's the systems? Well, that's why we have a judiciary to adjudicate these things. That's why it's so important, as Steve was saying, that the Supreme Court rules it is the law of the land. Even if you don't like it, it's the law of the land. That'll be a really important test moving forward. So the courts are important. Elections are important, yeah? I mean, we think that the court stuff is going to happen, and it might. I know there's going to be rulings, and there already have been, but it's probably going to go at a slow pace, slower than the people in the media would want us to see. So there'll be an election around the corner. That's another very important guardrail to prevent abuses of executive power.
So Abby, you do some work with Emily's List, helping to recruit people to run for office. Have you considered running for office yourself? Is it something you're thinking about?
God, no. Like, I so enjoy being behind the scenes, doing the comms work, like doing the grunt work. I also, like, there is a certain type of person that can be in office, and I am not that girl.
Okay, well, you know that about yourself, but I guess part of it's interesting, though, that you said it that way, because when Jean and I did our Civil Dialogues town hall at the Bush School, the Bush Library in College Station, one of the topic was, you know, why choose to serve or not? And I think the fact that aside from the fact that you might feel like you don't have the temperament to actually be the type of person who would serve, I'll use myself as an example, because obviously I'm an engaged citizen and I care deeply, and I have considered running for office, but I won't because the system is so messed up, and I feel like I can make more of a difference doing this than I could if I actually ran for office. So my question to you is, do you have peers that are thinking about running for office? What are their thoughts about our political system as it exists now? What are you seeing, especially in your role as you work with Emily's List and some of the other political things that you're doing?
I think that we're seeing more and more Gen Z start to consider it, but I think everyone that is considering it, at least on the Democratic side, in my generation, is feeling a little bit disheartened about age gaps after the last election. But I mean, one of the students in kinder already ran for county commissioner. There are a lot of people that I think are seeing openings and getting so frustrated with the system that they're starting to want change. And I think people are understanding that we're just gonna have to go take it. And I think with Emily's List, we're seeing that there are a lot of ways that the system doesn't work for women. And that's generally what we do. Like, we raise money early to try to help these women when they want to run for office. We have workshops when people are interested. We try to help them as much as we can. We get in early with their races. Especially because for women of color, it is so difficult to do it on your own. And so I think that my generation is starting to realize that building community, finding those people, like getting your resources together and just standing up for what you believe in is the right thing to do moving forward if we want change.
Kathy, you wanted to jump in? You jump in, and I'm going to go on down to the audience.
I'm going to interject to give a shout out because Abby referred to one of her fellow students at Kinder who ran for county commissioner in just down the road. It was in, I'm going to think of the county in a minute, but he became, one of my students wrote a story about him because the campaign was a model for how politics should be conducted. The two opponents became friends. And the guy who won, who was the incumbent, had nothing but wonderful things to say about this Mizzou student. And it was a completely positive campaign. And the angle of our story was, hey, grown-ups, listen up, this is how it should be run. So, yeah, it was great. So good on Kinder for training them up right.
Yes, way to go, Kinder. Okay, who's got the first question? Don't be shy. Okay, here we go. I love it. Excuse me. What's your question?
So my sons were here, they're high school students, and they had to leave because they're high school students, they have homework. But we had an active text debate going on while you all were speaking. And the question that came up in this text debate was, what happens if there is a constitutional issue that rises to the Supreme Court and the ruling is against the current president? And because right now there's no constitutional crisis because he is responding to the Supreme Court. But what happens if he doesn't abide by the ruling of the Supreme Court? One son says, then he'll be impeached. The other son says, maybe there's a forcible removal. But we don't have a forcible removal force in the United States. So what happens if he does not abide by the ruling of the Supreme Court?
Okay, that's a question for Steve and Jay, at least to begin with. Okay. I would not want to be you right now.
I mean, how cool that I have a hard time keeping up with my daughter's texting, so how cool that you can do that and do a family debate that way. I mean, it is. It's really cool. That's the whole point. We don't know. Nobody knows. There isn't a script. You know, there isn't something to follow. It's unprecedented. That's kind of, to me, what the crisis is that you're now in new terrain. And the old rules, the old system, you know, it might be kind of relevant, but it doesn't really provide. It doesn't provide a roadmap. And that's the whole point.
Steve, you want to add?
I think we've always had, in these crisis situations, we've had people step up. Whether it's, what was the election after the Civil War? Where they, you know, was thrown into Congress. 1876. Yeah. Hayes, yes. Hayes. And, you know, that was a very political compromise in the House, but it worked out. I think of Bush v. Gore all the time. Now, it seems like 99% of the people hate that decision. I think it was a courageous decision and the right decision that the Supreme Court made that settled the election. I remember we didn't know what was happening at the time. It kept going on, and we saw the craziness in Florida of the hanging chads, and the court stepped in. And
You're in Tallahassee that month.
You should have been working for one of the candidates' parents at the time. I think I took drugs.
I just want to interject to say I think this gets to the point that Jay made earlier, which I've been kind of obsessed with, which is the reason there's no script is that the normal script is what one of your sons said, which is there'd be an impeachment trial. It's totally unclear that that would happen here. And I think that the question is, when I was covering Congress, which I did for a long time up until the early, mid, 2010s, Congress had a very, members of Congress had a very proud, they always called them, we are the co-equal branch. And so even members of the president's own party, whatever that happened to be at the time, were very adamant that the president had to come and get permission from them to do certain things. I really don't think that attitude is prevalent anymore on Capitol Hill. And I think that's what sets up the unknown situation that Jay talks about, because our Constitution does have a remedy, which is impeachment, but it's not at all clear that that would happen. My sense is that members of Congress are very cowed right now.
Very what did you say? Very cowed? Is that what you
Cowed, yeah.
Before we take the next question, I just want to tell a quick story because you brought up Gore, Bush versus Gore. And you all talked about there's usually somebody who steps up to the plate. Well, who stepped up to the plate in that time frame was Al Gore. Yes. He gave an amazing concession speech after the Supreme Court ruling in which determined that George W. Bush had won the election. His speech to the nation, I recommend that you read it because it helped heal the nation almost immediately. Because he was gracious, he said all the right things, and he was the one who stepped up to the plate and helped put the nation back together, I think, after that. So just quickly, the night of his speech, I'm at home, and I get a call from my boss, that would be the father of the man who just was declared president, George H.W. Bush, and he wanted to know if I could get Al Gore on the phone for him. He said, I would like to talk to Al. And I said, you know what, sir, I don't think you're the person he wants to hear from tonight. I said, why do you want to call Vice President Gore? And this is what he said. I've been where he is. I know what it's like to lose. And his speech to the nation was just amazing. And I want to tell him, I feel really close to him right now. I know what he's going through. So I told him, I said, well, we can get him. He was vice president. I said, we can get him through the White House switchboard. He says, oh, I don't need you. I'm hanging up. So he hung up. And I'm watching all this on TV, and you see Vice President Gore come out of the old executive office building next to the White House where he made the speech. I see him get in the car. You're going to swear I'm making this up. I see him pick up the phone. And I thought, surely not. And 10 minutes later, President Bush called me. Just hung up with Al. He was really glad I called, Gene. We had a great talk, and anyway, but Al Gore is the one who stepped up to the plate. His speech to the nation was amazing. Anyway, next question.
Such a wonderful story. Right there, Jean.
Okay.
That's a really good lead-in to, I guess, a couple of comments, and then I'd love to hear any responses. One is that leadership does matter, but leadership without that conversation that we were talking about on this level doesn't matter. And I think that as much as I don't want to focus on the man who is the president currently, the crisis that we're in terms of electoral crisis, in terms of what's going on politically right now, we've got other crises, but in terms of that took place starting on January 6th, and it continues. It's the same crisis. It hasn't changed.
Thank you. Who wants to comment on that? Okay, Abby.
Go for it,
girl.
Abby.
Oh, Abby. I'm out of my element sometimes, but this is something I can actually talk about as being in Gen Z, being unseen by leadership. I do agree that I think that there's been a crisis, maybe even well before January 6th. I mean, there's a crisis for everyone that is a person of color, that's a woman, that's in a marginalized community, whenever they're attacked. And I mean, you can trace that like to the founding of America. So there's always been a constitutional crisis. I think the issue that we're having now in terms of being seen and why we're having so many issues and why we're having so many conversations about it, and I mean, that's not even just on the Republican side or Democrats at President Trump. That's even within the Democratic Party. There is so much uproar within our own parties because we're not feeling seen by our leaders. And maybe it's just because we're not having these conversations and we don't like go knock on our neighbors' doors anymore because we're in the digital age. I think that we need to start being able to talk to other people about how these leaders are affecting us. I think that that's a lot of the reason why I understand why Kamala lost, and why a lot of Gen Z didn't turn out the way that I thought they were going to, as much as it disappointed me, and why people were so upset with Joe Biden when I didn't necessarily understand. I think it's all about communicating with people at this level so then we all understand how to vote on the national level or even local and state. And writing to our congressman, which I think is like now a foreign concept for whatever reason, especially for Gen Z. So I think a lot of it is just we need to have more conversations like this so we're able to change the leadership in the way that we see fit. I think that America is in this like epidemic of miscommunication, and that's a lot of the issue.
Okay, questions?
Okay. Yes.
Mr. Davis, first of all, your opening comments, you were talking about presidents that have gone around the courts against a court ruling, and you mentioned Jefferson and Jackson. Go to Joe Biden. When the Supreme Court told him he could not do the student loan forgiveness, he found other remedies to go around it. Now my question is, and this fine lady behind me was asking my question, but I wanted to give you a couple quotes of President J.D. Vance last week. He said, and I quote, "The president should not listen to orders that constrain him. Judges are not allowed to control the executive's legitimate power." It scares me when I hear a public official say that they should challenge the courts. And I want to hear what you have to say about that.
And a public official who is the vice president.
So I thought about going there with Joe Biden, and in several instances, and the Missouri student loan lawsuit being one of them, his Justice Department ignored those orders and continued to do what they were doing, and the Supreme Court would slap them down, and then I think finally on the student loan forgiveness, the Supreme Court said, this program expires in a few days anyway, so there's no point in us ruling again. But there are other court cases where, and the courts just said the Department of Justice has ignored our prior decision. So it does happen, and this is what makes people on my side of the aisle very frustrated when Republicans are called out. And they're just frustrated. Now, you raised J.D. Vance. I totally agree with you. I cannot condone that attitude.
Jay?
Two things in response to that, and I totally agree with Steve. This is not unprecedented in modern times, that you have tensions between the executive and the judiciary, that we have an imperial presidency and presidents exercising more and more power. That being said, what we've seen in the last 6 weeks is on a different scale than anything beforehand. So there are precedents, but now we're seeing a rapid increase. So I think that's why it's concerning. The point about J.D. Vance, go back to the origins, the coming of the Civil War. There was a dirty word that you were not allowed to use in early America, and the word was disunion. You could not say that. If you said that, you were sort of stigmatized as someone who was treasonous, seeking to break down the republic. But once that norm had been breached, once someone started using the word disunion, it became really attractive and incentivized for others because you got attention for doing so. You became kind of a political figure or a sensation, and you see an escalation of that actual word. And that word, that concept, is really important to plant that in people's minds before you actually go about doing the thing that, of course, the southern states did in 1861. So disunion was that word. And so that's why I really think that these norms, even just like rhetorical norms, they don't seem like a big deal. And yeah, someone violates it. Oh, the guy on the left did it first, and then the guy on the right does it. Everyone does it. You know, it's the cumulative, corrosive effect of it. So I think that quote in particular was really disconcerting.
Okay, we have a question. I'm going to make her come down here. In the interest of full disclosure, this is my first cousin. On the Becker side, there are 39 of us, and I'm number 10, and I just sat here counting. You're number 37.
Oh, I'm sure.
There's 30. We have 39 Becker first cousins, which is irrelevant to this story. What's your question?
My question is really for Abby. So I am a parent of 3 Gen Zs. My baby's here, and my oldest is 25. And he likes to talk about politics. And we were talking about something a few weeks ago, and I said to him, you know, when you boys were kids, little, if you'd fight over Legos, I'd tell you to work it out. And he said, Mom, you got to realize with my generation, if we get in a fight over Legos, we're told to pick up our Legos and go home. That's how we were brought up. So when it comes to bridging gaps, and especially as Gen Z is becoming more politically active, hopefully running for office, how do you see anything different with your generation, and where do you see this generation going as you get older and older and start to need to work with people across the aisle?
Oh gosh, I think I also would subscribe to that idea that like we're kind of being told right now to like pick up our Legos and go home. I think that especially I think this is very symptomatic after the 2016 election, that a lot of people decided that they just weren't going to listen anymore if we had different views because we would get so frustrated. And I mean, that's where I think like the miscommunication started for us, because we just never learned how to talk to other people. And I want to be optimistic and think that that's different, or that it will change. I think that we're going to just start realizing that we either have no choice and we have to try to work across the aisle, or we're just going to get like increasingly polarized. And I mean, that's happening just like within the own parties, like, and even in the middle. I mean, there are a lot of people that are just not listening to each other anymore. And I think in some ways, social media was our attempt to try to fix that, until the algorithms got way too revenue-based and ad-based. And I would say that I'm optimistic for that to change as well, but I'm not entirely sure. I think that growing up and going to college, or growing up and just becoming a part of your community, is like the best way to be able to have those conversations and teach other people in Gen Z to like have those hard conversations, or even like forcing them to just talk it out. It's like a thing right now, I think, for people around my age, which is like 21, 22, to just like put down the phone and have the hard conversations in person instead of sending like the long text that's like all blue and like freaks someone out. So I think part of it is a maturity thing. So I want to be hopeful that we'll get to that point, and especially by the time that we're able to run, like hopefully people have it figured out by then. But yeah, I think that people are starting to realize once you kind of hit college age, like 20s, that you can't just pick up your Legos and go to another place anymore. Like, you got to talk it out if that relationship is that important to you. For some people, it's not, and that's okay, and that's everyone's own prerogative. I mean, I struggle with that as well when it comes to value decisions or value judgments that end up conflicting. And that's everyone's own journey. But I think that hopefully we can start meeting in the middle somewhere on both sides.
Okay, I have another question on this side, and then we'll send it back to that side.
Okay.
You're going to notice a trend here. This is my nephew. I didn't
Gene,
set this
people
up.
are going to think that we stacked the audience. You need to stop
I have
saying
more
who your
cousins
family
back
members
there.
are.
Okay, Eric.
I first want to thank everybody else that has asked a question because I was supposed to go first. So thank you.
That was our plan, in case none of you had a question.
But in all seriousness, I want to kind of go back to that idea or the thought of the executive order. It seems like with the high amount and volume that we've seen at the beginning of this presidency or this term, that it seems like that it becomes a tool to circumvent. So I can push my agenda without going through the right channels. I can just sign this piece of paper, and now we move forward. And so my question is that where do the checks and balances come from that standpoint, or is there a line that just once that is crossed, that a president says, no, I'm going to sign this because it's my executive order, that we say, no, stop?
Don't all jump at once.
I covered Congress for a long time, as well as the White House, and an executive order is only as good as the term of the president, and so that's why I think for a lot of people it's like ping pong. We've been going back and forth.
Most of Biden's executive orders at front were undoing Trump's at the beginning, and now most of Trump's are now undoing President Biden's.
So, so if you want to affect real change, you really have to go through Congress. And why is that important? That's because we have to have those hard conversations that Abby was referring to. That's where those hard conversations traditionally have taken place. I think Congress is stymied for a number of reasons. Gerrymandering, I think, is a big one. Too much money in politics is another one. Because when I first came to Washington, members of Congress would love to talk to reporters because we were their avenue to people back home, and they had time to talk to us. Over the years, we became less and less important on their callback list as fundraisers became more and more important. So
And they could just tweet.
Yes, well, that's part of it, but I do think there's going to be a backlash to some of the social media, which I also think is part of the problem. It's tribalized America, and I think the more people's consciousness can be raised to that, the better. But I think that the reason you've seen so many presidents using the executive orders is that Congress has just been stymied. And they are frustrated, and then the people become frustrated because we're not having those hard conversations and doing the compromise that is required in a nation of 330 million people.
As was mentioned, DACA, that came about after years of Congress not doing its job to fix the system.
Yeah.
So President Obama said, I'm just going to do it.
Yeah, and on immigration, you think about this, the last time that we really tried to pass a comprehensive immigration bill was under George W. Bush. George W. Bush was in favor of it. Mitch McConnell, who I think was, I can't remember if he was minority or majority leader at the time, was in favor of it. His Democratic counterpart was in favor of it in the Senate. Nancy Pelosi was in favor of it. John Boehner, I think, was the Republican leader in the House. Everybody was for it. And it failed. And it failed, I think, largely because of a grassroots movement from radio talk show hosts. And that was not the majority of the American people, but it intimidated members of Congress. And so I think there's a disconnect between the actual will of the people and then special interest groups that are very loud, very powerful, very well funded, and they are overriding the voice of the people.
That's a great point.
Fast forward a few years until last year on immigration, when there was a bipartisan bill that was ready to go, but Trump said, I want to run on immigration, don't you dare pass that. And so here we are, right? here we are.
Can I make one more point real
Please.
quick here on this? Bear with me. I'm going to do 90 seconds of being a professor, if that's okay. Maybe to step back from the Trump thing, and if you were to look around the world in the last 10 or 15 years, you would map out a pretty similar trajectory, especially in Western democracies, of tensions over executive authority. Now, we tend to say, oh, that's because populist right-wing nationalism is on the rise. That explains some of it, but not all of it. It's not always right-wing populists that are using executive power. It's also left-wing governments that are doing so. I rather suspect that it's not driven by ideology, but it's driven by the imperatives and the needs that different countries are under, the strains they're under right now. The old forms of social democracy, which, let's be honest, we have an 18th century constitution, but our social democratic system is a creature of the 20th century, and it is around the world as well. That was the age of aggregating power. Different societies had to build massive armies in the world wars and during the Cold War. They had to cut deals with different constituencies and different groups of people. They corralled social forces into democracies. That project was so successful that in some ways you don't really need to engage with the people anymore. You need to act quickly and decisively, and you need to do so in accordance with your own objectives and beliefs. So for a right-wing nationalist, it might be, shutting down the freedom of the press and speech. Left-wing governments, they want to cut red tape so they can do climate change, decarbonization projects.
They want to shut down freedom of the press, too.
Okay? But what I'm getting at here is to think of this not as a Trump-Obama kind of phenomenon, but to think of it as this is what the 21st century looks like. The old forms of government and power that were born in the 20th century are now having to be adapted to completely new contexts. And that's why it's probably disorientating, and that's why looking backwards to think maybe we can go back to that era, I'm not sure that's ever going to be the case.
Another question here. Full disclosure, this is my husband, okay? Since we're going with the family theme.
My question is open. The question that I have is, how do you think in the future AI is going to affect the truth and many other things in politics?
Just a little bitty question.
We talk a lot about that at the School of Journalism, and it's not just AI. I mean, first of all, AI has been in your life for a long time. You just don't know it. But AI is what regulates your social media feed. These are algorithms. AI is just a form of algorithm that does some pretty cool stuff. But one of the things it does is aggregate data on what you like, where you're shopping, it's not necessarily attached to you, but to your zip code, your cohort, and that is what, as you are reading, and the more you're consuming news online, the more your news feed is tailored by AI to keep you on the site where you are reading, watching, listening, because that's how people make money, by advertising. And so this capitalist imperative, it's now called surveillance capitalism, is really fueling this tribalizing of Americans because, and it's why, your cousin might have been a little bit leaning left or a little bit leaning right, and now suddenly you can't have Thanksgiving dinner together, because you really are seeing two different realities if you're online. And I think people need to understand that. And I think what I see among my students is more people starting to put down their phone, deleting certain apps that are addictive. And back in during the Industrial Revolution, there was a movement in England called the Arts and Crafts movement. which was sort of back to old artisanal ways of doing things. And I see something similar happening. I don't know if Abby sees it as widely as I do, but I have this manual Royal typewriter in my office, and people are fascinated by it. And it's sort of this analog thing, and I think people understand, at least younger people maybe better than we do, how, because their lives, they are the texting generation. Facebook was born in 2004, which is about the same year that most of my students were born, give or take. And so they've grown up with this, and so they're, I think, becoming more sensitized to the impact of AI on news consumption, on the reality you see, and I think we all need to be more sensitive to that. Yes.
I have a question over here. Were you
Okay,
gonna say
and then I
something?
have a question.
And
me.
for the record, this is not a relative. I have no idea who this man is.
I don't know, I may be the missing link, you know. Thank you all for being here. I've just got a question about the debate of a living constitution, and is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Very cool.
Softball. Well, you know, that's the debate. I'm an originalist, original public meaning. I think a written document loses all meaning if it's not interpreted as it was written. I don't know how to characterize the debate. Yes, it's a huge debate. You know,
I can chime in.
Please.
As a young person, as a person of color, and as a woman, growing up in an age of a lot of activism, I would say that I would be a person that subscribes to the idea of a living constitution only, well, not only, but mostly because I don't see myself reflected in it. And that's the whole point of this country, to be able to see yourself in American ideals and to see them like manifested in our government and in our society and in yourself. And if I can't see it in that document, why can't it grow? Like, why can't we see these ideas morph into like societal norms, I guess? Like the founders didn't know that there were gonna be AK-47s that were like harming my schoolmates. I think there are things in a modern day society that we would never have guessed when the Constitution was written that needs to be adapted to protect people my age.
Well, the Constitution is hard to change, but it is changeable. And I think we forget, after the Civil War, it was massively changed. They call it the second founding. You know, before then, there was no freedom of the press in a particular state, no freedom of religion in a particular state. I mean, the Bill of Rights did not apply to the states until after the Civil War, and the 14th Amendment and the Supreme Court started us down that path. That was a huge change. It can be done again if the people want it. Now, it is difficult. It would require everyone working together. On the other hand, on the other end of the spectrum, there's a state constitution, the Missouri Constitution, which we change every single election, and has grown from, you know, I don't know how long it is anymore, 200 pages or something, and it's, so there's a middle ground there, I think.
I think I'd weigh in. I mean, you've probably all thought about this question, and you know what you think. You either are for original public meaning, original meaning, or you think that the Constitution needs to adapt with the times. Yeah, and so that's the debate. That debate, that way of framing our understanding of the Constitution is itself a creation of our era. That's not like how people used to see. That wasn't the debate about the Constitution in the 19th century. It wasn't even really the debate about the Constitution in the first half of the 20th century. That's of our era. That debate, I think, has run its course, okay? I think it'll still play out, and the courts bless them. This is what's good about them, even though we hate them when they don't do exactly what we want them to do. They move at a glacial pace, and we have justices that are going to be there at the top, but also at all the other courts for a long, long time. So it'll be a slow, gradual change. But I think that whole paradigm, that way of thinking about how do we adjudicate constitutional disputes and questions, that's going the way of the dodo bird. There'll be something new in its place, and I'm quite excited about that possibility.
Okay, we've got maybe about 5 minutes or so left, and we have a question here.
What is your standpoint on like how everything is being blamed on the executive branch, as a lot of events have happened that have been pinpointed on Trump and Kamala, but like really haven't been centered on the other branches?
I think you're exactly right. We've mentioned Congress has been dysfunctional for decades now, and that is attributable to many things. People who don't care as much about who they're voting for. Gerrymandering is something, money in politics, where politicians have to spend 90% of their time raising money and 10% legislating and making policy. I think a lot of the media could help more. The headlines that say Trump is authoritarian, I don't think that helps. I think people need to, dig deeper. And not just look to the easy answer. Yes, Trump is grabbing the headlines. That's what he likes to do. But the executive has amassed so much power over the past 40 years because Congress has built this administrative state that makes every decision of every minute detail. Justice Gorsuch goes around the country and talks about to audiences, hey, you probably don't realize, but each one of you has probably committed a felony today. And that's because there's some administrative rule and horrible stories of enforcement of those rules that we have allowed to be perpetuated by the federal government. Trump now is trying to scale that back. And that's why people are happy with what he's doing. He's trying to dismantle that. I'm frustrated when people just blame Trump and look to Trump for making these moves when it's a deeper issue that's been calling for reform for a long, long time. Now, he's doing it in kind of a reckless way, I think, but there is, I think, some reason for it.
Okay, I love that the youngest member, I'm going to, we're running out of time.
Okay.
We have a couple,
Good question,
I think two more. Well, I want everyone to applaud. The youngest member of the audience just asked a great question.
Yeah.
So he deserves applause. So I'm going to challenge the panelists. Pretend you're working for USA Today. We're running late. We have two more questions, I think.
Two or three. Yeah.
2 or 3. Make your answers not New York Times length, but USA Today length, okay? Because they're going to kick us out of here. So the last question I'll take from someone, another cousin on my mom's side. I was her maid of honor. Okay.
My question is for the media. With the AP being kicked out of the White House and the Pentagon, what can the rest of the media do to support it? And because I've watched many press conferences, my second question is, what can we, the people, besides, excuse me, subscribing to newspapers, do to support the media?
Great question. Thank you. I'm very proud of you.
Yeah,
okay,
thank you. Thank you for that question. I think the most important thing you can do is subscribe. You can actually donate to the Associated Press. You can go online and donate. You can't really subscribe to the Associated Press. And I would say, to echo something that Abby said, write to your member of Congress about why you think it's important that the role of the media be protected. Congress has a press gallery too. All of these things will trickle down. Write to your state legislator about why you think it's important that media be protected, because members of money, I think it's very, very easy to get cynical about politics and to say, oh, they're all alike, they only listen to people with money. And money has a big impact, but not as much as the voices of constituents. And I think if people understand you still have the power, use it before you lose it.
Great answer. Yeah.
Thank you, Kathy. What's your question?
That's a great lead into my question. With the discussion around the Constitution and how it's being stretched and challenged in the presidency, and I haven't heard the words fascism or oligarchy, but the people, the prices of eggs are still skyrocketing and the stock market is still tumbling. We've talked about the president, we've talked about the Constitution. The people are still concerned about the cost of living, and the stock market is not looking good. What do you have to say about the economy that plays a significant role in everything that we're talking about?
That's a great point. I mean, I think we should buckle our seatbelts. And again, I'm not blaming the Trump administration for this all, because this is a story that you're seeing across the Western world right now. High inflation, real price volatility, looming trade wars and tariffs. If that policy is going to work, that will take a lot of time before the economy, a free market economy, can adjust to a completely different political economic order. So it's going to be a very, very bumpy ride in the coming months, and one suspects years. And again, last point, it looks like a continuation of the volatility that can be traced right back really to the pandemic. And if one steps back as a historian and looks at the broader terms, back to 2007 and 8 and the collapse, it's been like that really ever since. So the power, the expectations that a president can change all this is the flip side of the points about executive power and everything, is like, we want the president to be able to solve all of our problems, and then we get mad at the president when the president writes executive orders because he wasn't the guy that we voted for. Presidents really don't have nearly as much power when it comes to the economy, which is an international economic creature.
We have one more question here.
What are the checks and balances on Doge, and what is it that we can do in dealing with what they're doing all over the U.S.?
That was my question, is whether Doge is constitutional, and what are the checks and balances on a government agency that is headed by or not headed by, depending on who you believe, someone who's not elected.
On something Steve said, you know, there are a lot of people, probably a lot of people in this state, they may not be in this room, but who are very happy with what Doge is doing. And I think the frustration that Steve alluded to of people who feel like there's this giant government bureaucracy and they can't get an answer, I think the reason that frustration is there is because normally the way you would complain is to go to your member of Congress. But they are preoccupied with fundraisers. And so I think that has been a huge problem, and I think we need to acknowledge that there is a reason Donald Trump won the election. And think about that. And there is a reason there are people who are happy seeing what Elon Musk is doing, because they have been agitating for change, asking for change, asking for change, and Congress wouldn't do it, and Congress wouldn't do it, and Congress wouldn't do it. And so now they got a guy with a chainsaw. So I just think we need, I mean, I'm a journalist, so I think we need to think about, I'm less interested in Donald Trump, to the young man's question here. I think it's less interesting. We, the media, tend to focus on the White House because it's one person. It's really easy to write about the White House. But writing about a systemic situation, and also readers, hello, we need you to read the stories. You know, you're clicking on Donald Trump, we can see it. And if you want us to write about complex stories, you need to come down there with us. But I think this question of why people are happy is what we really need to, that's the talking to each other.
Exactly. And I agree, that's what this whole forum is all about. Jay, I'm going to ask you to answer the other part of the question, which is whether it's legal or constitutional.
Well, I think DOJ itself is absolutely constitutional. I mean, it was an outgrowth of a pre-existing executive agency. I think the question is its actions. Is it breaching its authority and remit? And that's why there's all the cases before it. And I would suspect we'll get a mixed bag. We'll get courts saying in some instances it has breached those norms, and in others it hasn't. So that'll be the long game. But don't expect like DOJ to triumph, to dismantle the administrative state within a couple of weeks, and also don't expect courts to stop it either. This is kind of going to be a thing now.
Yeah, as far as I know, DOJ hasn't tried to shut down like a House office building or the Court of Appeals or something. So as far as I know, DOJ is working within the executive branch. The Constitution vests the executive power in one person, the president. He could make Elon Musk his chief of staff and do all the same kinds of things, as long as Elon isn't the one making the actual decisions, and the president is. I think it's constitutional.
There's so much more we could say here. But we really are out of time, and we've got a reception coming up in just a moment. But would you please give a huge round of applause to this incredible panel? Wow. Before I send you on your way to the reception, please, if you have the QR codes, you've seen them up on the screen, you should have been given one when you came in. Please take a moment to fill it out. We would love to know what you think about what we're doing. Please engage with us at civildialogues.us. Sign up for our newsletter and spread the word about what we're doing. We want to partner with more incredible organizations like the Kinder Institute and Missouri Humanities, and we really appreciate all of their support. So, Jean, I think we're going to call it a wrap. What do you think?
Well, I'm so proud that a room full of Cardinal fans, you all were amazing. Your questions were amazing. You were engaged. I'm going to say what? Oh, I'm going to say what Linda said at the beginning. Just by being here, you all are participating in our constitutional democracy. Just by being here, by asking the questions, you'd rather be home in your pajamas watching Netflix. So thank you, thank you. You were just a great audience, and I know we could go another hour. Don't worry, we're not. But there is a reception out there, and thanks to the Kinder Institute people.
Yes,
there's
absolutely.
They found out a couple hours ago there was no wine and beer, and they went and bought some. So there's wine and beer and small bites. Linda and I cannot come out and visit with you because we're taping. We have to do 2 tapings.
Yeah, we've got a couple of things, and in fact, if anybody would be willing to take 5 minutes and let me interview you to get your feedback on what you thought of tonight's program, I would love for you to just meet me in the back with my camera crew and just a couple quick questions. That would be it.
Yeah,
Would
we'd
love to get your thoughts.
Come join us. You
Yes.
four, amazing.
Yes,
I learned
amazing.
so much.
All of you,
Oh my
amazing.
God, I learned so much. I want to go have dinner, but I can't. But thank you.
Thank you for coming. Thank you so much.